Hey guys. Tonight we're easing ourselves into a story that feels strangely quiet for one that once shook an empire. You're here, maybe stretched out somewhere comfortable, staring at a ceiling that has definitely seen better days, while the world outside hums along without you. And into this calm slips the life of Charlotte of Wales, a young woman born into so much expectation that even breathing probably felt like a scheduled royal duty. You can almost feel the cold marble floors under your bare feet as you step into her world. The air heavy with candle smoke and rules. Honestly, if you were dropped into this level of pressure today, you probably wouldn't survive a week, maybe not even the group chat. You'd last about 5 minutes before Googling how to abdicate politely. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now, insomniacs of the world. Unite quietly. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in early 19th century Britain, a place that looks solid and confident on the surface, but underneath is held together with gossip, powdered wigs, and a worrying lack of emotional intelligence. This is the age of carriages rattling over stone streets, of newspapers passed hand to hand, of a monarchy that desperately needs to look stable even when it absolutely isn't. And right at the center of that need sits a small child, Princess Charlotte Augusta of Wales. You watch her arrive into this world in 1796, already carrying more political weight than most adults you know. She's the only legitimate child of George, Prince of Wales, yes, that George, the one who will later become George IV, and immediately she's treated less like a baby and more like a very delicate insurance policy. The nation exhales when she's born, a future secured, at least on paper. One common historical fact everyone learns is that Charlotte was second in line to the throne from birth. What's less often mentioned is how quickly that fact became the single defining feature of her entire existence. You hover near her cradle and notice something subtle. There's very little warmth in the room. Not because the fire is low, but because affection here is rationed, carefully measured. Charlotte's parents barely tolerate each other. And you can feel it in the way servants move more quietly than necessary. Like they're tiptoeing around a sleeping volcano. Her father, indulgent and selfish, treats life like an endless buffet. Her mother, Caroline of Brunswick, is isolated, mocked, and pushed to the edges of court life. And Charlotte? She's the rope in a very public tug of war. As you follow her through early childhood, you notice she doesn't laugh easily. This becomes something people comment on later, how serious she seemed. How mature beyond her years. The popular historical image paints her as solemn, even gloomy. But here's the lesser-known truth. Contemporaries also described her as observant to the point of discomfort. She noticed everything, the long pauses before replies, the way adults spoke differently when they thought she wasn't listening, the tension that crackled like static whenever her parents were mentioned in the same sentence. No wonder smiling felt optional. You imagine being that child, sitting straight-backed while adults discuss your future as if you're a piece on a chessboard. It's like being told, at age 6, that you're definitely running the company someday, just don't ask for a hug. And when Charlotte does show flashes of humor, They're sharp, dry, almost modern. Think less fairy tale princess, more sarcastic group chat moderator. There's a famous public perception that Charlotte was beloved simply because she was young and royal. But the deeper reason runs darker. People projected their hopes onto her. Britain had grown tired of scandal, excess, and disappointment. Charlotte, quiet and seemingly unspoiled, became a blank screen for national longing. A living, maybe this one will fix things. Which, honestly, is an exhausting thing to be before you've even learned long division. As you drift through these early years with her, you notice another strange detail historians still debate: just how aware Charlotte was of her political role as a child. Some argue she was sheltered, others that she was painfully aware. The truth probably sits uncomfortably in between. She knew enough to feel trapped, but not enough to understand why escape was impossible. And if that doesn't mess with your sleep schedule, nothing will. You pause in one quiet moment where Charlotte stands at a tall window, looking out over gardens she's rarely allowed to enter freely. The glass is cold. The future feels colder. There's no dramatic music here. No sudden tragedy yet. Just the slow realization that her life will never really be her own. It's the kind of realization that creeps in softly. Like realizing your phone battery is draining and there's no charger in sight. This is the beginning of the crown that will one day die with her, not in fire or rebellion, but in silence, expectation, and the unbearable weight of almost. And as you linger here with young Charlotte, you can already sense that this story isn't about what she did, but about what she was never allowed to become. You don't get to stay long in that quiet childhood moment, because the adults return, voices raised just enough to be dangerous. You follow the sound down echoing corridors and straight into the disaster that defines everything next: the marriage of Charlotte's parents. If childhood is supposed to feel like a safe room, this one has no locks, no padding, and definitely no emotional fire extinguisher. You watch George, Prince of Wales, and Caroline of Brunswick circle each other like opponents who were forced into the same ring without training or consent. Their marriage is one of history's most famously miserable arrangements. A union formed not from affection but from debt, politics, and a mutual misunderstanding so profound it could qualify as performance art. The popular historical fact is simple: they hated each other almost immediately. What's less commonly mentioned is just how publicly that hatred played out. With Charlotte stuck in the front row, you stand beside her as a small child while whispers turn into arguments, and arguments into strategic separations. Her parents don't just argue in private, they argue through letters, through lawyers, through allies at court. It's like watching a very slow, very polite divorce play out on a national stage. Except no one is allowed to say the word divorce without causing a constitutional headache. Charlotte becomes the leverage point. Whoever controls her controls the moral high ground. You feel the tension thicken when her parents separate formally. Charlotte is shuffled between households, each stay feeling less like a visit and more like a statement. With her mother, Caroline, there is warmth, chaos, and a certain embarrassing lack of royal polish. Caroline laughs too loudly, hugs too tightly, and ignores etiquette the way modern people ignore terms and conditions. With her father, George, there is structure, luxury, and a suffocating sense that affection must be earned, or at least approved by committee. Charlotte learns early how to read rooms. You can see it in the way she adjusts her posture depending on which parent she's with. How she edits her words before they leave her mouth. This isn't taught formally, but it's learned fast. Children in unstable households often develop this skill, and Charlotte becomes frighteningly good at it. Historians still debate whether this emotional awareness was a survival mechanism or a sign of early political intelligence. Honestly, it can be both, and that's what makes it so heavy. One well-known event from this period is the fierce custody battle over Charlotte. George insists on controlling her upbringing, arguing that Caroline is unfit, inappropriate, and, worst of all, uncontrollable. Caroline fights back with a mix of genuine maternal concern and her own flair for drama. The lesser-known detail is that Charlotte herself begins to express preferences. Even resistance. She writes letters. She sulks. She refuses to cooperate. For a girl raised to obey, these moments of defiance are small rebellions, like tapping Morse code through a prison wall. You're there when Charlotte realizes something devastating. Loving one parent automatically means betraying the other. There's no neutral ground, no safe opinion. If she praises her mother, her father sees it as an insult. If she obeys her father, her mother feels abandoned. It's the kind of emotional math that never adds up, no matter how carefully you calculate. Publicly, the monarchy pretends everything is manageable. Newspapers tread carefully, speaking in euphemisms and polite half-truths. Privately, the household is a mess of spies, reports, and servants who suddenly know too much. Charlotte grows up surrounded by adults who watch her reactions the way investors watch stock prices. A smile here, a frown there. Everything means something. There's a strange irony here that historians often point out, while George accuses Caroline of being morally corrupt. His own behavior is famously indulgent. Gambling, affairs, excess, it's all there. Barely hidden. Charlotte notices this hypocrisy long before she has the language to name it. You can almost hear her internal commentary. Dry and unamused, like someone silently reviewing a very expensive but very disappointing hotel. One peculiar, lesser-known fact from this period is how often Charlotte was used as a symbol in public disputes without being present. Pamphlets, caricatures, and political commentary referenced her as the innocent sufferer, a kind of living prop. She becomes famous for her unhappiness before she's famous for anything else. It's hard to smile naturally when your sadness has become a brand. As you move through these years with her, you notice how trust becomes a scarce resource. Charlotte trusts selectively, cautiously. She bonds with certain tutors and attendants, clinging to small islands of consistency. These relationships matter more than anyone at court realizes. Later observers will say she was stubborn, moody, difficult, but standing here, watching her navigate this emotional minefield, you think, she's exhausted. And then there's the silence. The kind that settles after arguments. Heavier than the shouting ever was. Charlotte learns that silence can be safer than honesty. You see her retreat inward, building a private world where thoughts stay unspoken and expressions are controlled. It's not that she never feels joy, it's that joy feels risky. Like something that might be taken away or weaponized. Historians still argue over which parent did more damage. Some blame George's control, others Caroline's instability. But as you stand beside Charlotte, the answer feels painfully clear. It's not about choosing sides. It's about a child being raised inside a conflict she didn't create and could never escape. By the end of this section of her life, Charlotte is no longer just a princess. She's a buffer, a bargaining chip, a walking compromise. And as you drift onward with her, one thought lingers, quiet but persistent. If this is what love looks like in a palace, no wonder she learns to live without smiling. You move forward without any clean break. Because Charlotte's life never really offers one. The arguments fade slightly, not because they're resolved, but because a new pressure rolls in and quietly takes over the room. You feel it before anyone says it out loud. This isn't just a family problem anymore. This is a succession problem. Charlotte is growing, and with every inch she gains in height, the weight on her shoulders increases. You walk beside her as whispers shift from poor child to future queen. Officially, she is now the heir presumptive, second in line. But functionally the nation's hope. Her grandfather, King George III, is aging and increasingly unwell. Her father, the Prince of Wales, is widely disliked. And that leaves Charlotte, still young, still forming, already being measured for a crown she hasn't asked for. The well-known historical fact is that Charlotte was immensely popular with the public. Crowds cheered her, pamphlets praised her. She represented continuity in a time of uncertainty. The lesser-known truth is that this popularity frightened the people closest to power. You notice how carefully her movements are managed now. How appearances are staged. How even her silences are curated. It's like watching someone become famous before they've had a chance to decide if they even like being seen. You sense a shift in how adults speak to her. The tone becomes heavier, more deliberate. She's no longer just listening, she's being addressed. Opinions are offered in a way that sounds suspiciously like instruction. When Charlotte asks questions, they're sometimes answered with smiles that don't quite reach the eyes. You've seen this before. In workplaces where everyone pretends you're being included while quietly steering you toward the correct conclusion. There's a moment often mentioned in biographies when Charlotte openly expresses sympathy for her mother in public. It's treated as a scandal, a teenage misstep, but standing here, you understand it differently. This is Charlotte testing her influence for the first time. She's discovering that people react when she speaks, that her words ripple outward in ways they never did before. Power, even accidental power, is intoxicating and terrifying all at once. You follow her through formal lessons and controlled outings. She's taught constitutional theory before she's allowed emotional privacy. Tutors drill into her the idea that monarchy is duty, not desire. A commonly cited event from this period is her resistance to being separated entirely from her mother. The lesser-known detail is how strategically she resists, choosing moments, allies, and language with care. She's learning politics the way others learn table manners. Historians still debate how much agency Charlotte truly had during these years. Some argue she was a puppet. Others that she was already shaping outcomes in small but meaningful ways. From where you stand, it feels like watching someone test the limits of an invisible fence. She doesn't know exactly where it ends. But she knows it's there, and she keeps brushing up against it. just to feel where it hums. Public expectation begins to harden around her. Newspapers describe her as virtuous, steadfast, serious. These traits are praised so often they start to feel like obligations. You can almost hear her internal monologue. What if I'm tired today? What if I don't want to be steadfast? It's the emotional equivalent of being told you're the responsible one in the family, compliment and curse in the same breath. One curious, lesser-known fact is how frequently Charlotte was compared not to queens, but to ideals. She wasn't measured against real people, but against abstract hopes, stability, morality, reform. No one asks whether she wants any of this. The assumption is that wanting is irrelevant. Duty doesn't require consent. You walk with her through moments of carefully managed public affection. People bow, hands are kissed, applause ripples politely. And yet, the loneliness persists. Being admired is not the same as being known. Charlotte begins to understand this distinction with uncomfortable clarity. You can feel it in the way she withdraws after events. How silence becomes her reset button. There's a dark irony that historians often highlight later. The more the public loved Charlotte, the more trapped she became. Her popularity limited her options. Any move she made carried symbolic weight. Any personal choice risked national disappointment. It's like being everyone's favorite character in a long-running show. You're not allowed to change, grow, or surprise anyone too much. As this phase of her life settles in, you sense something solidifying. Charlotte is no longer reacting. She's calculating, not in a cold way, but in a careful one. She's learning when to speak, when to wait, when to hold her ground. These are the skills of a ruler, or of someone preparing for a very long wait. And as you drift onward with her, one thought stays with you. Soft but insistent. The crown hasn't touched her head yet, but it's already shaping her spine, her silence, and the spaces where a smile might have lived. You don't notice the surveillance at first, because it arrives dressed as concern. It sounds reasonable, even kind. After all, this is the future of the monarchy you're watching grow up. And futures like that, you're told, need structure, guidance, supervision. And so, without any announcement, Charlotte's education becomes a carefully monitored corridor where every door opens only if someone else turns the handle. You walk beside her through long rooms lined with books she didn't choose. Her tutors speak in measured tones, their lessons wrapped in the language of improvement and refinement. Officially, Charlotte receives a thorough education: languages, history, religion, moral philosophy. This is the well-known part, the one that appears in biographies as proof she was being prepared for greatness. The lesser-known detail is how tightly curated this education is. Books are selected not for curiosity, but for safety. Ideas are filtered. Opinions arrive pre-approved. You notice how often Charlotte pauses before asking questions. Curiosity here is something you learn to disguise as obedience. When she does ask, it's with careful phrasing, like she's testing a microphone to see if it's live. You can almost hear her thinking, is this a real question? Or will this be remembered later? In a palace where memory is long and forgiveness selective, that matters. There's a common historical event from this period: Charlotte's growing frustration with the restrictions placed on her reading and correspondence. Letters are intercepted, visitors are limited, Even casual conversations are reported upward. The palace functions like a very polite surveillance state, complete with velvet curtains. The lesser-known fact is how inventive Charlotte becomes in response. She develops coded language, half-jokes, and emotional shorthand with the few people she trusts. It's not rebellion in the dramatic sense, it's adaptation. Historians still debate whether these controls were primarily about morality or politics. Some argue they were meant to protect her innocence. Others see a more strategic motive, shaping a future monarch who would not challenge existing power structures. Standing here, it's hard not to think it's both. Protection and control often share the same handwriting. You watch Charlotte sit through lessons that feel less like learning and more like rehearsal. Every opinion is framed as hypothetical. Every discussion circles back to duty. Even history is taught selectively, emphasizing stability over upheaval. Revolutions are mentioned the way people mention food poisoning, briefly, with a warning, and no details you might find inspiring. One strangely intimate, lesser-known detail emerges from this time. Charlotte forms emotional attachments to certain tutors that go beyond academic respect. Not inappropriately, but intensely. These adults become safe containers for thoughts she cannot express elsewhere. When one of them is dismissed for being too sympathetic, Charlotte feels the loss deeply. It's another quiet lesson. Closeness has consequences. You can feel the pressure tightening as she grows older. Adolescence arrives. Inconvenient and unstoppable. Emotions sharpen. Questions become harder to swallow. Charlotte's temperament, already serious, develops an edge. She is described by some as moody, by others as principled. The difference, as you know, often depends on whether a woman agrees with you. Publicly, nothing appears wrong. Charlotte is presented as disciplined, modest, exemplary. Privately, she chafes. You see it in the way she drags her fingers along the spines of forbidden books. In the way she lingers too long in conversations that feel real. It's like watching someone browse a locked app on a phone they technically own but aren't allowed to open. There's a famous incident where Charlotte openly resists one of her father's educational decisions, sparking a brief but intense standoff. It's usually framed as teenage stubbornness. But here's the lesser-known angle. She chooses this moment carefully. After gauging public sympathy and internal support, this isn't a tantrum, it's strategy, still rough around the edges. Historians still argue about whether Charlotte's education ultimately empowered her or diminished her. Did it give her tools? Or did it train her to self-censor too well? Watching her now, you suspect the answer is uncomfortably mixed. She learns how to think, but also when not to show it. As this phase settles into routine, you notice something subtle changing. Charlotte stops expecting freedom and starts negotiating for it. She learns the art of compromise early, trading compliance in one area for autonomy in another. It's a skill that will serve her later. Briefly, and then not at all. And as you drift forward, the memory of those controlled lessons lingers like the echo of a bell long after it's been rung. Knowledge, in Charlotte's world, is never just power. It's leverage, and she's only just beginning to understand how carefully it must be used. You move into the phase where Charlotte becomes visible in a way that's almost cruelly ironic. The public finally sees her, and immediately decides they adore her. You can feel the shift the moment she steps into wider view. The way whispers turn warm. The way expectation softens into hope. To the nation, Charlotte is no longer just an heir. She's a promise. And promises, as you know, are easiest to love when they haven't been tested yet. You walk beside her during public appearances, where applause blooms politely and people lean forward just a little too eagerly. She bows. She listens. She performs composure like someone who learned it the way others learn breathing. The well-known historical fact is that Charlotte was wildly popular, often compared favorably to her father. What's less often discussed is how deeply uncomfortable that comparison made her. Being loved instead of someone else is a fragile kind of affection, always threatening to turn. In public, she is described as virtuous, restrained, morally upright. In private, she feels watched, boxed in by those very compliments. You notice how carefully she manages her expressions now. A smile, when it appears, feels deliberate, like punctuation rather than emotion. It's the social equivalent of replying, noted, to a long, emotionally loaded email. You sense the contradiction sharpening. Adored by strangers, restricted by family. Crowds cheer for her autonomy while her movements are still approved line by line. She's invited to symbolize reform without being allowed to practice it. It's like being hired as the face of innovation but told not to touch any of the systems. Exhausting, honestly. One commonly referenced event from this time is Charlotte's growing alignment, at least emotionally, with political reformers who see her as a fresh start for the monarchy. Pamphlets praise her character. Satirical prints depict her as Britain's moral compass. The lesser-known detail is how this attention increases her isolation. The more she is admired publicly, the less freedom she has privately. Popularity becomes a cage with velvet padding. You're there during moments when Charlotte's frustration slips out, small comments, sharp silences, a refusal to perform cheerfulness on demand. These moments are reported, exaggerated, and interpreted. Some call her difficult, others call her strong-willed. Historians still debate whether these descriptions reflect reality or discomfort with a young woman who refuses to be decorative. Probably both. There's a subtle but important shift in how Charlotte relates to power here. She begins to understand that public opinion is a force, one that can protect her, but also trap her. She learns that saying the right thing publicly can buy her a little breathing room privately. It's not manipulation so much as survival, like adjusting your tone to keep the peace in a tense room. You notice another lesser-known truth. Charlotte starts craving anonymity. She longs for ordinary moments, walking without being followed, speaking without being recorded. Once, after a public event, she reportedly remarked on how strange it was to be loved by people who didn't know her at all. It's a comment that barely makes it into the records, but it lands heavily. Admiration without understanding can feel a lot like loneliness. Her relationship with her father grows colder during this period. George senses, correctly, that the public prefers her. Control tightens. Restrictions are reinforced. Charlotte responds not with loud rebellion, but with quiet withdrawal. You've seen this dynamic before. The way power struggles become quieter and more dangerous over time. Historians still argue about whether Charlotte could have leveraged her popularity more aggressively. Could she have forced concessions? Changed her circumstances? Standing here with her, the question feels unfair. She is young, constrained, and constantly reminded that one misstep could shatter the very support that protects her. Courage is easier to admire in hindsight than to live in real time. As you drift through this stage of her life, one image keeps returning. Charlotte standing just behind a curtain, listening to applause meant for her. The sound is warm, full, almost comforting, and yet she doesn't step forward. Because applause fades, control doesn't. You move onward knowing this contradiction will follow her, public darling. Private prisoner. Two roles stitched together so tightly they begin to feel inseparable. And somewhere between them, Charlotte continues to exist, quietly, carefully, still rarely smiling. You start to notice the rebellion not as a dramatic rupture, but as a series of small disruptions, like glitches in an otherwise very polished system. Charlotte doesn't flip tables or storm out of rooms. Instead, she hesitates when she's expected to comply. She asks questions that don't have comfortable answers. And in a palace built on predictability, that alone feels radical. You walk beside her as she grows into this quieter form of defiance. The well-known historical narrative frames Charlotte as stubborn, even difficult, especially in her teenage years. But standing here, it feels more like resistance with manners. She pushes back just enough to remind everyone she's still a person, not a ceremonial object with good posture. One commonly cited event is Charlotte's refusal to accept certain living arrangements imposed by her father. It's presented as adolescent rebellion. The lesser-known detail is how calculated her refusal is. She chooses timing carefully, aligning moments of resistance with peaks in public sympathy. It's the political equivalent of sending a risky message when you know the server logs are being watched. You feel the tension spike when Charlotte begins to articulate her boundaries more clearly. She expresses opinions about her own future, where she lives, whom she sees, what she reads. None of this is revolutionary by modern standards. Today, it would barely qualify as a diary entry. But in her context, it's seismic. Historians still debate whether Charlotte was naturally rebellious or shaped into resistance by excessive control. Watching her, it's hard to separate the two. Pressure doesn't create diamonds so much as it reveals fault lines. And Charlotte has plenty. There's a lesser-known but telling habit that develops during this period. Charlotte's use of humor as a shield. Dry, understated, sometimes cutting. Her remarks circulate privately and occasionally leak out. They're not loud jokes. They're quiet observations that land because they're accurate. Think less stand-up comedy, more devastating footnote. You notice how this humor helps her maintain a sense of self. When everything else is regulated, tone becomes freedom, a raised eyebrow, a carefully timed pause. These are things no one can legislate. Charlotte becomes fluent in subtext, which is basically the royal language anyway. A well-known historical fact is her growing estrangement from her father during these years. Communication becomes formal, sparse, strategic. The lesser-known truth is how emotionally costly this is for Charlotte. Resistance doesn't make her feel powerful, it makes her tired. Each act of defiance carries consequences, tighter rules, fewer allies, more scrutiny. Freedom always comes with a bill. You're there for moments where she almost gives in, where compliance would be easier. And then something in her stiffens, not anger. Exactly. But resolve. It's the feeling of realizing that surrender wouldn't even buy peace. It would only erase the last pieces of herself. Publicly, these tensions are smoothed over. Official statements emphasize harmony. Private letters tell a different story. Historians still argue over which version is closer to the truth. But you can feel the gap between them widening. Image and reality drift further apart, connected only by tradition and denial. You also notice Charlotte's empathy deepening during this time. Having lived under control, she's acutely sensitive to it in others. She listens closely to servants, attendants, anyone whose voice carries less weight than it should. This empathy is rarely highlighted in grand histories. But it shapes her character more than any lecture ever could. As this phase settles, Charlotte becomes something quietly dangerous to the status quo. A figure who understands the system from the inside and no longer believes in its benevolence. She hasn't escaped it, but she sees it clearly now. And as you drift onward with her, one thought lingers like a soft hum in the background. Rebellion doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, waits, and survives by refusing to disappear. The rebellion doesn't disappear, it simply changes shape. You feel the shift when conversations stop circling Charlotte's behavior and start circling her future. Specifically, her marriage. The tone becomes transactional, almost businesslike, as if her life is a document that's been open too long and now needs to be finalized. You don't hear anyone ask what she wants. You hear lists, names, advantages. Marriage, in this world, is not romance. It's architecture. It's how alliances are reinforced and risks are managed. The well-known historical fact is that Charlotte's marriage was treated as a matter of national importance. What's less often mentioned is how early this pressure begins, and how clearly Charlotte understands what's happening. She knows she's being positioned, not courted. You walk with her through a parade of potential matches discussed in hushed rooms. Each candidate is evaluated like a policy proposal: temperament, religion, political usefulness. Compatibility is mentioned the way people mention weather, briefly, and with no expectation of control. Charlotte listens, silent, absorbing more than anyone realizes. There's a commonly referenced moment when Charlotte is presented with Prince William of Orange as a suitable husband. On paper, it's perfect, Protestant, politically strategic, internationally reassuring. In reality, Charlotte recoils, not dramatically, not publicly, but decisively. The lesser-known detail is how she articulates her refusal. She doesn't say no outright. She questions terms, conditions, consequences. She dismantles the proposal by exposing what it would cost her. Historians still debate whether her rejection was driven by personal dislike, political instinct, or fear of further confinement. Standing here, it feels like all three braided together. Marriage to William would mean leaving Britain, losing influence, becoming distant from the very people who support her. For someone whose power exists largely through public connection, that's not a union, it's exile. You sense her awareness sharpening. Charlotte understands now that marriage is the final lever of control. Once she's wed, negotiation ends. Autonomy narrows. Expectations solidify. It's like agreeing to a contract written in permanent ink while everyone else gets pencil. Her father, George, pushes hard. He frames the arrangement as reasonable, even generous. Charlotte resists with the tools she's honed over years of surveillance, silence, delay, selective compliance. She doesn't scream. She waits. She makes it difficult without making it scandalous. This frustrates everyone involved far more than open defiance ever could. Public opinion quietly aligns with her again. Pamphlets and private conversations suggest sympathy for her reluctance. The well-known narrative paints her as romantic and willful. The lesser-known truth is more practical. Charlotte understands leverage. She knows the monarchy cannot afford to crush her completely without consequences. That knowledge becomes her shield. You're there during moments of deep exhaustion. Charlotte is tired of being strategic just to remain intact. She jokes, dryly, about how everyone wants her happiness, as long as it looks exactly like obedience. It's one of those jokes that makes people laugh and then quickly change the subject. Historians still argue whether Charlotte could have chosen differently if circumstances had been gentler. But watching her now, it's clear that choice itself is the luxury she's fighting for. Not romance, not rebellion, just the right to consent. As this phase closes, one thing becomes unmistakable. Charlotte will not be moved easily. Marriage may be inevitable, but submission is not. And as you drift onward with her, the pressure thickens, not because the system is winning, but because it's running out of quiet ways to make her comply. The tension doesn't resolve, it pauses. Like a held breath, and in that pause, something unexpected happens. You feel it the moment Charlotte enters a room and doesn't brace herself for impact. The air shifts. The rules don't disappear, but they soften, just enough to be noticeable. This is what happens when Leopold of Saxe-Coburg enters her life. You watch their first meetings with a kind of cautious disbelief. Charlotte is guarded, practiced at disappointment. Leopold is different, not because he's dramatic or charming in the obvious way, but because he listens without trying to steer. The well-known historical fact is that Charlotte fell deeply in love with Leopold. What's less often mentioned is how quickly she recognizes something even rarer than affection: respect. You stand close enough to notice the small details. Leopold doesn't interrupt. He doesn't correct her opinions. He doesn't treat her thoughts like preliminary drafts waiting for approval. For Charlotte, this is disorienting. It's like speaking a language you didn't realize you'd been translating your whole life. Her guardedness doesn't vanish, but it loosens. There's a commonly cited event where Charlotte openly expresses her preference for Leopold, pushing back against alternative matches. This is often framed as romantic defiance. The lesser-known truth is that it's also strategic alignment. Leopold offers her something no other proposal has: proximity to Britain, emotional partnership, and, crucially, a willingness to let her remain herself. In a system built on control, cooperation suddenly feels revolutionary. Historians still debate Leopold's motives. Some portray him as genuinely devoted. Others suggest ambition, carefully masked as affection. Standing here, you realize the debate might miss the point. Whatever Leopold's long-term intentions, in these moments he provides Charlotte with something she's never had: space. In space, to someone raised under constant observation, feels like love. You notice Charlotte's demeanor changing in subtle ways. She speaks more freely. Her humor sharpens, not as defense but as delight. She still rarely smiles, but when she does, it's unguarded, brief, almost private, the kind of smile that doesn't perform for anyone else. It's not a transformation, it's a return. Public reaction is cautiously positive. Leopold lacks the intimidating political baggage of other suitors. He appears calm, principled, supportive. Pamphlets soften, anxiety eases. The well-known narrative celebrates this as a rare royal love match. The lesser-known tension is how fragile this approval is. It depends entirely on Charlotte remaining both happy and useful, a balance history is terrible at maintaining. You're there when Charlotte insists on conditions. She negotiates terms of residence, influence, and independence. This isn't the wide-eyed surrender people expect from a young bride. It's a treaty. And remarkably, Leopold agrees. Historians still argue whether this was generosity or calculation. From Charlotte's perspective, it hardly matters. Agreement is agreement. For the first time, Charlotte feels aligned rather than cornered. Marriage no longer looks like a trap, it looks like a doorway. Narrow, yes, but open. You can almost hear the internal recalibration happening. Hope doesn't rush in loudly. It settles carefully, like someone testing the floor before committing their weight. As this chapter of her life begins to take shape, you sense something fragile and precious forming. Not happiness exactly, but the possibility of it. And in Charlotte's world, possibility is rare enough to be cherished. You drift onward knowing this calm won't last forever. History rarely allows it to. But for now, in this brief interval between resistance and consequence, Charlotte allows herself to believe that her life might finally be her own, even if only for a while. The shift is almost imperceptible at first. Like realizing you've been breathing shallowly for years and only now taking a full breath. Charlotte doesn't announce her happiness. She doesn't dramatize it. You simply notice that the tension in her shoulders eases. That her silences feel less defensive and more restful. This is what happiness looks like for someone who's never trusted it before, quiet, cautious, and fiercely protected. You move with her into married life. And the contrast is striking. The well-known historical fact is that Charlotte's marriage to Leopold is described as genuinely affectionate. Letters survive that show warmth, humor, even playfulness. What's less often discussed is how deliberately private this happiness is. Charlotte has learned the cost of visibility. Joy, she knows, attracts attention. Attention attracts control. You watch her and Leopold together in moments that never make it into official portraits. Conversations that wander. Walks without an entourage hovering quite so close. Decisions made jointly, not imposed. For Charlotte, this feels almost unreal. Like discovering a hidden room in a house you've lived in forever. She still checks for exits. Still expects interruption, but the room remains. Historians still debate how much influence Charlotte intended to exercise once she became queen. Some argue she was content to be supported. Others believe she was quietly preparing for active rule. Standing here, the answer feels layered. She doesn't crave power. She craves agency. And with Leopold, agency becomes possible without conflict. That alone feels radical. One commonly referenced event from this period is the improvement in Charlotte's public demeanor. She appears calmer, more confident, even, occasionally, approachable. The lesser-known detail is how carefully this confidence is rationed. She doesn't overextend. She knows that peace is fragile. Like a phone battery that finally charges past 50%. She's relieved, but she's still watching the percentage. You notice how Charlotte begins imagining a future that isn't entirely defensive. She talks about reform, about moderation, about a monarchy that listens instead of lectures. These aren't speeches. They're thoughts spoken aloud, tentatively, like trying on shoes before buying them. Historians still argue whether these ideas were fully formed or merely emotional reactions. But ideas don't need to be finished to matter. There's a strange tenderness in how Charlotte handles this happiness. She doesn't flaunt it. She doesn't demand recognition. It's as if she's afraid history might overhear and intervene. And honestly, given her track record, that fear isn't irrational. You're there when she laughs, really laughs, for the first time in a way that feels unforced. It's brief, almost startled. She covers it instinctively, like someone who forgot they were in public. It's the kind of moment that would never survive a court report. But it lingers with you. Proof that the girl who never smiled, always kid, she just needed safety. Public expectations don't disappear, but they soften. The nation relaxes. Just a little. Charlotte's happiness reassures people more than any proclamation ever could. The crown, it seems, might finally be resting somewhere stable. Historians later call this a moment of hope. Standing here, it feels more like a pause before the next breath. As you drift forward, you sense time speeding up. Happiness compresses. Days feel fuller, shorter. Charlotte allows herself to believe, not recklessly, but sincerely, that her story might finally follow a gentler arc. That the long years of control and resistance were leading somewhere worth arriving. And in this brief, quiet chapter, you understand something essential. Charlotte's happiness isn't loud enough to rewrite history. But it is real enough to make what comes next feel unbearably cruel. You feel the shift before anyone names it. Because Charlotte's body begins to speak in ways her words never have. Fatigue settles in differently now, heavier, slower, with a strange sense of purpose attached to it. Pregnancy arrives not as a private milestone, but as a national event. And you can almost hear the collective intake of breath across Britain. This isn't just a child. This is the child, the future, once again, compressed into one fragile form. The well-known historical fact is simple. Charlotte became pregnant soon after her marriage. And the nation rejoiced. Bells rang. Toasts were made. Hope surged. What's less often discussed is how quickly her body stopped belonging to her. Doctors, advisors, relatives, everyone suddenly has an opinion. Charlotte, who fought for autonomy her entire life, now finds herself managed in a new way. One that comes wrapped in concern and smiles. You stay close as her days become regulated by schedules, diets, and expectations. Eating is monitored. Rest is prescribed. Movement is restricted. This is framed as care. And some of it genuinely is. But control has always worn convincing disguises around her. Pregnancy, instead of freeing her, tightens the net again. It's like upgrading software only to find the privacy settings reset to default. Historians often note that Charlotte followed strict medical advice during her pregnancy, including severe dietary limitations. This is the commonly cited fact. The lesser-known truth is how extreme and exhausting these regimens were. She is encouraged to eat sparingly to ensure a smaller baby. A belief rooted in contemporary medical theory and deeply flawed logic. You can feel the irony pressing in, after a lifetime of restriction. Even nourishment is now rationed. You notice how Charlotte tries to stay composed. How she jokes lightly about discomfort. Using humor the way she always has, to soften edges. To keep control of the narrative. But there are moments, quiet ones, where her exhaustion shows. Leopold worries openly, gently pushing back where he can. His concern is real, but his power is limited. Tradition speaks louder than affection. Publicly, Charlotte is celebrated as radiant, glowing, fulfilled. Privately, she is tired, uncomfortable, and increasingly isolated again. Appearances are reduced, not to give her peace, but to preserve an image. The nation wants reassurance, not honesty. Historians still debate whether Charlotte herself sensed danger. Some suggest she was optimistic. Others believe she felt uneasy but trusted the authority surrounding her. From where you stand, it looks like cautious hope layered over deep fatigue. There's a strange emotional contradiction during this time. Charlotte is happier than she has ever been, and more constrained than she's been in years. Her future seems secure, yet her present feels precarious. You can almost hear her thinking that once the child is born, once this stage is over, she'll finally be able to breathe freely again. It's the kind of promise people make to themselves in difficult seasons, not knowing how thin the margin really is. You're there when she speaks softly about motherhood, not in grand terms, but with quiet curiosity. She wonders what kind of parent she might be, how different things could be. These thoughts aren't recorded in official histories, but they matter. They reveal a woman thinking forward, imagining continuity instead of survival. Historians still argue about the medical competence of those overseeing her pregnancy. Some defend them as products of their time. Others point to clear warning signs ignored out of confidence and convention. Watching it unfold, you feel the weight of that uncertainty. Knowledge is limited, authority is absolute, and Charlotte is expected to trust both. As this phase settles into uneasy routine, the sense of inevitability grows. Not tragedy, yet, but gravity. Everything slows. Attention narrows. The world seems to lean in too close. And as you drift onward with her, you carry the quiet dread that often precedes history's cruelest turns. The feeling that something precious is being prepared for a moment it may not survive. You step into a room that smells faintly of herbs, starch, and confidence that probably shouldn't be trusted. This is the world of early 19th century medicine, where authority speaks louder than evidence and tradition is treated like a personality trait. Charlotte's pregnancy has entered the phase where doctors take center stage, and you can feel the atmosphere shift from cautious care to rigid certainty. The well-known historical fact here is that Charlotte was attended by Sir Richard Croft, a highly respected physician of the time. He is calm, experienced, and very sure of himself, always a slightly alarming combination in hindsight. The lesser-known detail is how narrowly defined his approach is. Croft strongly believes in non-intervention, in letting nature take its course, and in restraining anything that might look like haste. In an age before modern obstetrics, this philosophy is fashionable. It's also dangerously inflexible. You watch Charlotte comply. She has spent her entire life navigating authority. And doctors are simply another version of it, white coats instead of crowns. Latin instead of law. She follows instructions carefully, even when they conflict with her instincts. Remember that strict pregnancy diet? It continues. Small meals, limited strength. The goal is control, not comfort. It's like being told your phone will last longer if you never charge it past 20%. Historians often note that Charlotte trusted her medical team. That's the commonly accepted narrative. What's less discussed is how little room she had to do otherwise. Questioning doctors in this era is seen as impertinent. Especially for a woman. Especially for a pregnant one. Authority stacks up around her like furniture you're not allowed to rearrange. You sense Leopold's unease growing. He asks questions. He suggests alternatives. Politely. Carefully. But medical hierarchy outranks marital concern. Croft reassures everyone that all is proceeding normally. The phrase, perfectly normal, appears often in later accounts. Which is rarely comforting when you think about it too long. There's a subtle tension here that historians still argue over. Whether Charlotte's labor plan was overly conservative or dangerously negligent. Some defend Croft's methods as standard for the time. Others point out warning signs, prolonged discomfort, exhaustion, signs of distress, that might have justified intervention. Standing here, you feel the gap between confidence and competence widening by the hour. Charlotte herself grows quieter, not fearful, just deeply tired. You can hear it in her breathing. Slower now, more deliberate. She jokes once about how everyone seems very calm for people with so many opinions. It's dry, understated, and lands softly. One of those jokes that makes you smile and then immediately feel bad for smiling. The room becomes a waiting room in the most literal sense. Everyone is waiting. For progress. For reassurance. For nature to cooperate. Time stretches. Elastic and unforgiving. You know that feeling. Watching a loading bar hover at 99%. Convinced that touching anything will make it worse. Historians still debate whether intervention at this stage would have changed the outcome. It's one of those questions that can never be answered cleanly. Which is why it keeps being asked. From where you stand, the tragedy isn't just what's done or not done, it's the certainty with which decisions are made. And the silence they demand in return. As this chapter closes, the medical confidence in the room feels almost loud. Too loud. And Charlotte, who has learned her whole life how to endure systems that claim to know best, settles into stillness. Not surrender, just trust. Given because there seems to be no other currency left. You drift onward with a quiet awareness settling in. Sometimes history doesn't turn on villainy or cruelty, but on certainty, calm, well-meaning, utterly convinced certainty, and the terrible things it refuses to imagine. The night doesn't arrive all at once, it stretches itself thin. Hour by hour, until time loses its edges. You're there as labor begins and then simply keeps going. This is the long night historians mention briefly and move past too quickly. As if naming it fully might give it more power than they're comfortable with. Charlotte has entered labor, and the room settles into a tense stillness disguised as patience. The well-known historical fact is that Charlotte's labor lasted more than 50 hours. That number appears clean and clinical on the page. Standing here, it feels anything but. Hours fold into each other. Candles are replaced. Faces change shifts. Charlotte remains exhausted, determined, unbearably composed. Her body works without reward, like a system running at full capacity with no progress bar in sight. Sir Richard Croft remains calm, steady, reassuring. He repeats that everything is proceeding naturally. That intervention would be premature. This is the accepted wisdom of the time. Wait. Trust. Endure. The lesser-known detail is how visibly drained Charlotte becomes as that wisdom plays out. She hasn't eaten properly in days. Her strength is thin, stretched beyond reason. Leopold stays close, helpless in the way only someone watching a loved one suffer can be. You hear Charlotte speak less now. When she does, it's brief, requests for water. Small acknowledgments, fragments of humor that flicker and disappear. She is not dramatic. She is not panicking. That calm will later be cited as evidence that all was well. Historians still debate whether her composure masked danger or delayed action. From where you stand, it feels like endurance mistaken for safety. The room fills with the soft, repetitive sounds of waiting, footsteps, whispered consultations, the quiet confidence of people who believe time is on their side. You've seen this kind of waiting before, when everyone agrees not to do anything because doing nothing feels safer than making the wrong move. Responsibility dissolves into routine. At last, after an almost unreal stretch of effort, the child is delivered, a son, stillborn. The announcement lands without ceremony, like a door closing somewhere far away. This is the moment often noted in histories as tragic but brief. What's less often mentioned is the silence that follows, the kind that absorbs sound rather than reflecting it. Charlotte is told gently, too gently, perhaps. She listens, nods faintly. There are tears, but they come slowly, as if even grief has to queue behind exhaustion. She asks after Leopold. She asks if the child is truly gone. These questions are recorded only indirectly, but they echo loudly here. Historians still debate how much she understood in that moment. Watching her, it's clear she understands enough. Doctors assure everyone that Charlotte will recover. She is weak, but stable. Croft is confident. The danger, they say, has passed. This reassurance spreads quickly, clung to desperately. The night is almost over. Morning feels close enough to touch. You stay with Charlotte as she drifts in and out of sleep. Her breathing is shallow but steady. There's a fragile sense of relief in the room, the kind that settles in too early. People begin to believe the worst has happened and ended. As dawn approaches, the long night loosens its grip. Light creeps into the room. The world resumes, cautiously. And yet, standing here, you feel a quiet wrongness humming under the relief. The kind of unease that comes when a system congratulates itself too soon. You drift onward carrying that unease with you, knowing that history often hides its sharpest turn not in the moment of catastrophe, but in the breath afterward, when everyone believes it's finally safe to rest. The morning arrives with that thin, unreal light that follows long nights. The kind that feels borrowed rather than earned. You're still there when people begin to move more freely again. Voices lifting just a little. Relief settling in like a fragile blanket. Charlotte has survived the labor. They say, the danger has passed. History, however, has a habit of waiting until confidence relaxes before it makes its final move. Charlotte wakes weak but lucid. You stand close enough to see how drained she is. How pale the room makes her look. She speaks softly, asking simple questions. About Leopold. About rest. About when she might regain her strength. The well-known historical fact is that she initially seemed to be recovering. That detail appears in nearly every account. What's less often emphasized is how precarious that recovery truly was. How quickly it relied on optimism rather than evidence. Doctors reassure everyone again. Sir Richard Croft remains composed, convinced that what Charlotte needs most is rest. Intervention is minimal. Monitoring is light. In an era without antibiotics, without blood transfusions, without real understanding of postpartum complications, confidence fills the gaps where knowledge should be. Historians still debate whether earlier action could have changed what comes next. The question lingers because the answer can never arrive. As the hours pass, you notice subtle changes. Charlotte grows restless. Her pulse weakens. Her skin cools. These signs register slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the room itself doesn't want to acknowledge them. Leopold senses it before anyone else does. He stays close, holding her hand, speaking quietly, trying to anchor her to the moment. Charlotte's awareness drifts in and out. She speaks of her parents, of reconciliation, of hope that Leopold will be cared for if she doesn't recover fully. These words are reported in fragments later, but here they feel heartbreakingly complete. She is not afraid, she is practical, and that may be the most devastating thing of all. Historians often note her composure at the end. It becomes part of her legend. The lesser-known truth is how young she still is, just 21 years old. Her life barely unfolded. You feel the weight of that youth pressing against the finality settling in the room. This isn't the end of a long reign or a full life. It's a future collapsing inward. Charlotte's condition worsens rapidly. Pain returns. Weakness deepens. The doctors finally recognize the severity. But by now their options are gone. Authority, so confident for days, suddenly feels small and helpless. Croft's calm fractures, though the records smooth this over later. Historians still debate his responsibility, his decisions, his timing. Standing here, blame feels both unavoidable and insufficient. Charlotte knows. You can tell by the way her gaze steadies, by the way she squeezes Leopold's hand once. Deliberately, she asks him to remember her kindly. Not grandly, kindly. It's such a simple request. And it carries the weight of everything she's endured. In the early hours of November 6, 1817, Charlotte of Wales dies. The words are short, brutally efficient. They don't capture the stillness that follows. The way the room seems to exhale and then stop entirely. Leopold remains beside her, stunned, holding a future that no longer exists. This is the moment the crown effectively dies with her, not legally, not ceremonially, but emotionally. The line everyone had leaned on vanishes overnight. Historians often call her death a national tragedy. Standing here, it feels more intimate than that. It feels like a silence spreading outward, touching everything it reaches. You drift onward carrying that silence with you, knowing that nothing in this story will ever quite recover its original shape again. The sound that follows Charlotte's death isn't immediate chaos. It's a hush so complete it feels engineered. You're there as the room settles into stillness. Servants frozen mid-step. Doctors suddenly unsure where to put their hands. News doesn't rush out, it leaks. Slowly, like cold air through a cracked window. And when it finally reaches the public, the reaction is unlike anything Britain has seen in generations. The well-known historical fact is that the nation went into mourning. Shops closed, bells tolled, black crept into wardrobes and windows alike. What's less often discussed is how personal this grief felt to people who had never seen Charlotte in person. You can feel it in the streets. This isn't obligation. It's shock. It's as if the country lost someone it had been quietly rooting for. Someone it believed in without fully realizing how much. You walk through London as the news spreads, watching faces fall in real time. Conversations stop mid-sentence. Newspapers are clutched a little too tightly. Charlotte wasn't just a royal figure, she was a future people had invested in emotionally. And futures, once imagined, hurt terribly when they vanish. Historians often note the scale of the mourning as unprecedented for someone who never reigned. That's the accepted narrative. The lesser-known detail is how spontaneous it was. No proclamation could have forced this response. People wept openly. Strangers spoke her name softly. Like saying it too loudly might make the loss sharper. It's the emotional equivalent of realizing your favorite show was cancelled forever, except this time it mattered. You notice how grief takes on a moral tone. Charlotte becomes idealized almost overnight. Her seriousness is reframed as virtue. Her reserve becomes wisdom. Even her struggles are softened into symbols. This isn't dishonesty. It's grief trying to make sense of itself. Historians still debate whether this sanctification obscured the real woman. Standing here, you realize it probably did. But grief isn't interested in accuracy. It wants comfort. There's another, quieter layer to this mourning. Many people see Charlotte's death as confirmation of something wrong within the system itself. Pamphlets circulate, not openly revolutionary, but uneasy. Questions hover just below the surface about medical authority, royal pressure, and the cost of tradition. These conversations don't make it into official histories as boldly. But they exist. They always do. You pass Leopold, now utterly alone in a country that loved his wife more than it ever knew him. His grief is private, almost invisible. He doesn't perform it, he carries it. Historians will later note his dignity, his restraint. What's less mentioned is how dislocated he is. How completely the life he was building evaporated in a single night. As mourning deepens, the absence becomes clearer. There is no child, no immediate heir. No emotional buffer between the public and the deeply unpopular figures waiting behind Charlotte in the line of succession. The silence she leaves behind isn't empty, it's loud with implications. Historians still argue about the political impact of this moment. Some frame it as symbolic, others as structurally decisive. Standing here, it feels like both. The nation isn't just sad. It's uneasy. Something trusted has failed, and no one quite knows how to articulate that without sounding disloyal. You drift through black-draped streets and hushed rooms, feeling how grief reshapes memory in real time. Charlotte becomes more than she was, brighter, purer, almost unreal. And yet, beneath that glow, the raw fact remains. A young woman died. And with her, A vision of the future quietly collapsed. As you move onward, you sense that this mourning won't fade cleanly. It will settle into institutions, into decisions, into the shape of what comes next. Grief, like power, has a long afterlife. Grief doesn't end when the mourning clothes come off. It lingers, reshaping conversations, hardening silences, and quietly demanding answers that no one is eager to give. You feel that tension now as the initial shock of Charlotte's death gives way to something more uncomfortable: blame. Not shouted, not formalized, but present, hanging in the air like damp. Officially, there is no scandal. The narrative settles quickly into one of tragic inevitability. Childbirth is dangerous, they say. Fate is cruel. Everyone did their best. This is the well-known version, repeated often enough that it starts to sound like truth. What's less often acknowledged is how many people privately question that story. The room may be quiet, but minds are not. You move through court corridors where conversations stop when you approach. Doctors avoid each other's eyes. Advisors choose their words carefully. Sir Richard Croft, once so confident, becomes a figure people mention with hesitation. Historians still debate his responsibility, whether his adherence to non-intervention was reasonable for the time or disastrously rigid. Standing here, you feel how blame fragments rather than settles. No single decision stands alone. That's what makes it unbearable. Charlotte's death creates a strange vacuum. Without her, responsibility floats, unattached. Was it the medical system? The pressure placed on her body? The cultural obsession with restraint? Or simply misfortune layered on misfortune? Each answer threatens someone powerful. So none are spoken aloud. Silence becomes policy. You notice how quickly official memory begins to smooth over rough edges. Charlotte's suffering is softened. Her long labor is condensed. The exhaustion, the warning signs, the doubts, they fade from public retelling. Historians later argue about whether this was intentional or instinctive. From where you stand, it feels like a collective flinch. Looking too closely would mean admitting preventability. And that's a heavier grief. There's a lesser-known but chilling detail from this aftermath. Sir Richard Croft does not recover emotionally. Publicly, he is defended. Privately, he is isolated. Accusations swirl quietly. Less than 3 months later, he takes his own life. Historians still debate the weight of guilt versus pressure. But his death adds another layer of tragedy to an already unbearable story. One loss compounds another, and no one feels vindicated. Leopold retreats almost completely from public life. He refuses to participate in blame or defense. His silence is not forgiveness, it's exhaustion. You sense that he understands what the system needs now: quiet. Not justice, not reckoning, quiet. And so the moment for real accountability slips away, unnoticed by all but a few. Public grief slowly transforms into private frustration. People stop wearing black, but conversations grow sharper. Charlotte becomes a reference point. What might have been used in arguments about reform, medicine, and monarchy itself. Historians still argue whether her death accelerated change or merely exposed the cracks already there. Watching it unfold, you suspect exposure is enough. As this phase settles, you realize something unsettling. Charlotte's death is being processed not as a failure, but as a lesson. one absorbed without acknowledgement. The system bends just enough to survive, not enough to confess. And confession, is where healing usually begins. You drift onward with a sense of unresolved weight. The silence around Charlotte's death isn't empty. It's crowded with regret, defensiveness, and questions no one ever officially answers. And in that silence, the crown continues to exist, but it no longer feels whole. The silence doesn't last long before panic replaces it. Because grief is patient but succession is not. You feel the shift almost immediately. The way solemnity snaps into urgency once someone finally says the unthinkable out loud. There is no heir. Charlotte is gone. Her child is gone. And suddenly the monarchy looks less like a line and more like a question mark drawn in ink. This is the well-known historical moment when Britain faces a genuine heir crisis. King George III is elderly and unwell. The Prince Regent, Charlotte's father, is deeply unpopular and, crucially, without legitimate surviving children. Behind him, a collection of royal brothers exist, many of them middle-aged, unmarried, or inconveniently entangled in relationships that don't count. What's less often emphasized is the emotional whiplash of it all. One week, the nation is mourning a future. The next, it's scrambling to manufacture one. You walk through courtrooms where the tone has changed entirely. Where there were once black clothes and lowered voices, there are now ledgers, lists, and timelines. Advisors speak quickly. Decisions are reframed as necessities. The system that failed Charlotte now reveals its most anxious face, efficient, unsentimental, and suddenly very interested in reproduction. Historians still debate how close Britain came to a true constitutional crisis at this moment. Some argue the line of succession was technically clear. Others point out how fragile legitimacy felt in practice. Standing here, you sense that legality isn't the issue. Confidence is. Without Charlotte, the monarchy loses its emotional anchor. And everyone can feel it. The Prince Regent reacts poorly. As expected, public sympathy for him is thin. His grief, real or not, is overshadowed by resentment. Charlotte had softened his image by contrast. Without her, he stands alone in the spotlight. And the light is unforgiving. You can almost hear the collective sigh of a nation realizing that the future it trusted is no longer available. Behind the scenes, royal uncles are summoned back into relevance. Men who had comfortably lived on allowances and distance are now examined with new interest. Their marital status becomes a matter of national concern. Who is available? Who is suitable? Who can produce an heir quickly enough to reassure everyone? Romance, once again, is politely escorted out of the room. There's a strange, almost darkly comic quality to this moment. Middle-aged princes suddenly rushing to legitimize their lives feels like a royal version of panic buying. Historians often describe it dryly as a renewed interest in marriage. The lesser-known truth is how transparent the desperation is. The crown, it turns out, has no backup plan. You sense how Charlotte's absence haunts every conversation. Her name isn't spoken often. But it doesn't need to be. She's the metric everyone measures against, the lost certainty. The standard of hope. Historians still argue whether this crisis would have unfolded differently if she had lived even a few more years. From where you stand, it's impossible not to think so. Public trust wavers, not dramatically, Not revolutionarily, but noticeably. People begin to see the monarchy less as destiny and more as administration. The magic thins. Charlotte's death didn't just remove an heir. It exposed how improvised the whole structure really is. As the court scrambles, one truth settles in quietly. The crown did not die with Charlotte-in-law. But something essential died with her in spirit. The confidence that succession was natural, inevitable, almost gentle. That illusion is gone. You drift onward with that realization humming softly in the background. The system moves forward because it must. But it does so without the grace it once pretended to have. And without the young woman who might have given it a different shape. Urgency has a strange way of flattening dignity. And you feel it now as the royal family pivots from mourning to logistics with barely a pause for breath. What follows is one of the oddest chapters in British royal history. So odd it almost feels unreal if you don't slow down and really look at it. This is the moment historians politely label the rush to secure the succession. You can call it that. Or you can call it what it feels like, panic. The well-known historical fact is that several of King George III's sons suddenly hurried to marry after Charlotte's death. The lesser-known truth is how openly transactional it all became. Courtship is reduced to timelines. Fertility becomes a qualification. Age gaps widen. Past scandals are quietly reclassified as youthful misunderstandings. You walk through conversations that sound less like romance and more like emergency planning meetings. You watch middle-aged princes, men who had avoided respectable marriages for decades, suddenly reinvent themselves as eligible. It's almost surreal. One moment they're known for mistresses and debts. The next they're being introduced to suitable brides like software updates desperately pushed before a system crash. Historians still debate whether this scramble was inevitable or humiliatingly revealing. Standing here, it manages to be both. There's dark humor threaded through this period. Even at the time, satirical prints circulate quietly, poking fun at the sudden wave of royal weddings. The public notices the desperation. They understand exactly what's happening. Charlotte's absence has turned private reproduction into public policy. And it's uncomfortable for everyone involved. You sense how different this feels compared to Charlotte's own marriage. Her union with Leopold had been watched. Yes, but it carried hope. This feels mechanical. No one is pretending otherwise. Love is optional. Legitimacy is not. Historians still argue whether any of these marriages would have happened without Charlotte's death. It's hard to imagine they would have. At least not with this speed. Behind the scenes, medical advice shifts too. Suddenly, intervention is no longer taboo when it comes to ensuring heirs. The irony is sharp enough to sting. The system that prized restraint during Charlotte's labor now values results above philosophy. History doesn't announce its hypocrisy, it just moves on. You can't help but feel Charlotte's presence in her absence. Every hurried engagement, every awkward union, exists because she isn't here. Her quiet seriousness, her careful resistance, her brief happiness, all of it contrasts painfully with this frantic aftermath. Historians still debate whether she would have approved of what followed. Watching it unfold, you suspect she would have recognized it immediately. Fear dressed up as duty. And then, out of this rush, something unexpected happens. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. One of these newly arranged marriages produces a child. A girl, born not from hope, but from necessity, the future once more, compressed into a cradle. As you drift forward, the absurdity fades and consequence takes its place. The crown, scrambling and undignified as it is, has managed to reproduce itself again. But the shape of what's coming feels different, less romantic, more resolute. You carry one quiet realization with you. Charlotte didn't just die young. She died at the exact moment when her absence would force the monarchy to reveal how fragile, reactive, and human it truly was. And history, having exposed that truth, is not done yet. The child arrives without fanfare, at least compared to the expectations that once surrounded Charlotte. There are bells, yes, and formal announcements, but the emotional temperature is different now, cooler, steadier, almost cautious. You're there in 1819 when Princess Alexandrina Victoria is born, later to be known simply as Queen Victoria. She enters a monarchy still slightly breathless from its own panic, a system relieved to have produced something that resembles a future again. The well-known historical fact is that Victoria becomes queen in 1837 and reigns for decades, shaping an era that will bear her name. What's less often emphasized is how directly her existence is tied to Charlotte's death. Without Charlotte's loss, this child is a footnote, not a turning point. You can almost feel the ghostly arithmetic of it all. How one life's absence creates space for another's inevitability. You stand quietly near Victoria's cradle and sense none of the warmth once projected onto Charlotte. This is a different kind of hope. Less romantic, more pragmatic. The monarchy has learned something painful, and it no longer dares to dream out loud. Security now matters more than symbolism. Historians still debate how much Charlotte influenced Victoria's upbringing indirectly. Some suggest Charlotte's fate served as a cautionary tale about control, about medical authority, about the dangers of emotional neglect. Others argue the system simply reset and repeated itself. Watching the early signs, it feels like both. Lessons are absorbed selectively. Change happens, but only where it doesn't threaten structure. You notice how Victoria is raised under intense supervision, echoing Charlotte's childhood in uncomfortable ways. And yet, there's a subtle difference. Fear has replaced confidence. The adults around Victoria are determined not to lose another heir. That determination shapes everything, from discipline to health to public exposure. Charlotte's absence is never mentioned, but it's everywhere. There's a quiet irony historians sometimes point out. Charlotte might have been the better prepared ruler. Emotionally and politically, Victoria, by contrast, will have to grow into power while already holding it. Historians still argue which path is more dangerous. Standing here, you suspect that neither is gentle. As Victoria grows, the memory of Charlotte fades from public conversation, but not from institutional memory. Decisions are made differently now. Risks are weighed more carefully. The monarchy becomes less personal, more procedural. Charlotte's death didn't just change who would rule, it changed how ruling would be approached. You feel the timeline stretching forward, carrying Charlotte's unrealized future into Victoria's very real one. The crown survives, empires expand, history marches on. And yet, something intimate has been lost along the way. The belief that goodness alone might be enough to inherit power safely. As you drift onward, the connection becomes clear. Queen Victoria's long reign is not just a beginning. It is a consequence, a structure rebuilt hastily on the absence of a young woman who never reigned, but whose shadow quietly defines what comes next. You don't arrive at this part of the story with trumpets or announcements. You arrive the way Charlotte's memory survives, quietly, indirectly, almost by accident. Years have passed now, and history has done what it always does. It has moved on. New reigns, new scandals, new certainties, and yet, Charlotte lingers, not as a ruler, but as a question that never quite gets answered. The well-known historical fact is that Charlotte of Wales never became queen. That sentence appears neat and complete in textbooks. What's less often explored is how actively people continued to imagine her as if she had. Writers, politicians, and ordinary citizens speculate in private about what kind of monarch she might have been. Serious, moral, restrained, reform-minded. Historians still debate whether this image reflects reality or grief's idealization. Standing here, it feels like both, a real woman softened into a symbol. You sense how Charlotte becomes a reference point rather than a person. When Queen Victoria later faces criticism, some quietly wonder whether Charlotte would have handled it differently. When debates arise about royal restraint or responsibility, Charlotte's name surfaces like a footnote with emotional weight. She becomes a hypothetical ruler, which is strangely safer than a real one. Hypotheticals don't disappoint. There's a lesser-known detail about this phase of her legacy: Charlotte's seriousness, once seen as a flaw, is recast as wisdom. Her lack of easy smiles becomes evidence of depth. It's ironic, almost cruel. The traits that made her difficult to manage in life make her easier to admire in death. Historians still argue whether she was truly austere or simply cautious. Watching how her image evolves, you realize that memory edits more aggressively than any censor ever could. You think back to her brief happiness with Leopold, the moments when she allowed herself to relax, to imagine a future. Those moments rarely survive in public memory. They complicate the narrative. A woman who almost smiled is harder to mythologize than one who never did. So the smile fades again, this time from history itself. Charlotte's unrealized reign becomes a kind of moral measuring stick. She represents a monarchy that might have been gentler, more emotionally literate, less reactive. Historians still debate whether that's fair or simply projection. From where you stand, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that people needed her to mean something, and still do. You notice how this kind of legacy is uniquely fragile. Charlotte didn't leave laws or speeches behind. She left expectation. And expectation is easy to reshape, easy to borrow, easy to lose. Over time, she becomes less of a person and more of a pause in the historical sentence, a moment where things could have gone another way. As you drift toward the end of her story, one thought settles gently. Charlotte's power was never exercised, but it was felt, in absence, in contrast, in the way her life forced systems to react rather than continue comfortably. That may be the quietest form of influence history allows. And in this space, between what happened and what almost did, you begin to understand why her story refuses to disappear. Some crowns aren't worn. Some reigns exist only in the shape of the world that forms without them. You arrive at the end of Charlotte's story without any sense of resolution. And that feels appropriate. There is no coronation to recall. No long reign to summarize. No decisive moment where everything finally makes sense. Instead, you're left with absence, and the strange weight it carries. Charlotte of Wales becomes remembered not for what she ruled, but for what ended with her. The well-known historical idea is that Charlotte represented a turning point that never quite happened. A bridge between an unpopular past and a hoped-for future. What's less often said is how final her loss felt at the time. This wasn't just delay, it was collapse. The crown didn't shatter publicly. But something essential failed quietly. And everyone felt it. You think back through her life, the controlled childhood, the parents locked in conflict, the education shaped by fear of independence. You remember her resistance, careful and measured, and the brief window where happiness finally felt safe. Historians still debate whether Charlotte's temperament would have made her a good queen. Standing here, that question feels almost beside the point. What she offered was something rarer than competence: trust. Charlotte's death didn't just remove an heir. It removed the belief that the system could correct itself gently. Everything after her is faster, harsher, more procedural. Victoria's reign will be powerful, but it will not be innocent. The monarchy learns to survive, not to soften. You notice how Charlotte's story ends the way it began, in silence. No scandal, no revolution, just a gradual fading, like light leaving a room without anyone turning it off. Historians still argue whether that silence was imposed or inevitable. From where you stand, it feels earned. Charlotte lived quietly under pressure. And she is remembered the same way. And yet, her absence speaks. In the reforms quietly considered. In the caution that replaces confidence. In the way later generations sense that something precious was lost before it could be tested. Some crowns die not in fire, but in restraint. You let the image of Charlotte soften now, not as a symbol, not as a tragedy, but as a young woman who endured more than she was ever meant to. And who briefly, almost shyly, touched happiness before history closed the door. The story slows here. The edges blur. You feel the noise of politics and consequence drift further away. Like a conversation fading in the next room. Charlotte's life doesn't end with answers, it ends with quiet. And maybe that's why it lingers so gently in the mind. There's nothing left to argue with. No decisions to replay. Just the steady realization that not all losses announce themselves loudly. You imagine Charlotte not as history remembers her, but as she was in those rare unguarded moments, sitting, breathing, allowing the weight to slip for just a second. No expectations, no symbolism, just stillness. Your thoughts begin to stretch out. Longer now, softer. The sharp lines of cause and effect dissolve into something calmer. You don't need to hold the timeline together anymore. It can rest. The crown that died with her doesn't fall. It simply fades, leaving behind a different kind of legacy, one built from restraint. From almosts. From the gentle ache of what never had the chance to be. Stay there for a moment. Let the images dim. Let the rooms empty. Let the silence do its work. End of script. Sweet dreams.